these, policy that they have, probably thousands and thousands, in fact, probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of these policies, right? And every single one of these policies, some of them may have a couple $1,000s in cash value, some of them have the tens, some of them even have hundreds, if not even millions plus of cash value, right? So what do? They basically put that cash value, your portion of that money to work, right? So think of it, let's say give an insurance company, hypothetically speaking, that they have total of $1 billion, right? For the ease of the example here, I'm just using a round number, $1 billion of cash value asset, right? That they need to put it to work, right? Now, we know that it's going to be going, tied into different index accounts like S&P 500, right? But behind the scene, this is what it does. So insurance company take the $1 billion, the cash value, and what it does is that it uses that to actually buy typically government bonds, 30 years bonds or 10 years treasury bills, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Now, why those? Well, because these bonds, 30-year bond or 10-year treasury bills, they are considered one of, if not the safest investment, right? It tied directly to the U.S., right? So now these bonds or these T-bills, they don't pay too much. Yesterday I looked up 30 years bond rate is about 4.8%, give or take. 10 years treasury bill is about 4.2, 4.3%. Obviously it fluctuates, right? So for the sake of example, let's say an average these bonds pay out about 4.5% interest rate, right? So in other words, out of the $1 billion of that cash value money that is in bond pay out every year about $45 million. You guys follow me so far, right? 4.5% out of the $1 billion, right? Now, what do they do with that $45 million, the interest earned from the bond? They use that to actually buy what they call the call options on the specific index or on the underlying index, such as S&P 500, such as QQQ, depending on the products that you have, depending on the options that they offer. Some of those are proprietary index as well too, right? So think of it, $45 million used to buy the call option on these index. Now, if we say that $45 billion used to buy these index or these stocks, everybody understands how that works. But what kind of confused people is buying the call option on the index. What does that mean? In other words, how does call option works, right? So let's understand that a little bit, okay? So I usually like to use house, for example, right? Because everybody understands house. It could be any commodity, right? So supposedly, if you are interested in investing in house, let's say this particular beautiful house that you're thinking about investing, current market value $200,000. Now, how would you normally invest in house? What do? You come up with $200,000, either cash or you borrow money from the bank, so-called mortgage loans, right? But one way or the other, you buy this house with $200,000. Isn't that true? Right? Now, let's say sometime later, supposedly a year later, the house value appreciates. It becomes $250,000 market value, just like stocks. It might appreciate, right? The price go higher. So now, this investment that you have made a year ago on this house give you return on investment 25%, right? And how does that work? How do I come up with 25%? Well, you bought it for $200,000. You could sell at market value for $250,000. So in other words, your profit is what? $50,000, right? $50,000 profit. But in other words, how much did it take you to make this $50,000 profit? Well, $200,000, right? So in other words, 50,000 divided by 20,000, that's 25%. So in other words, your return on this investment is 25%. Same thing goes buying stock, same thing goes buying any index account, right? You buy a certain price, if you can sell different price, whatever the difference is your profit, right? And that's how you calculate the return, right? How much have you gained, right? So that's pretty straightforward. Now, a different way of doing the similar investments will be this. Supposedly, there's another house or the same house that is $200,000 market value. Now, instead of you buying the house with the $200,000 cash, you may say, you know what, Mr. John, I'm not interested in buying your house. However, I'm interested in entering a contract with you that in the next 12 months, you and I have pre-agreed price of $200,000 for this house. In other words, in the next 12 months, I can buy from you your house for this pre-agreed price of $200,000, right? During that period of time, okay? No matter what happened to the market value of the house. Now, in a way, this person, John, is giving me the commitments. Does it make sense? A legal commitment saying that if I want to buy this house anytime during the 12 months, he must sell it to me, and he also must sell it to me for what? $200,000, right? Now, for that commitment, for that obligations, I have to pay him something. Because he's not going to promise me for nothing. Isn't that true? So let's say I have to pay him $10,000, right? For that obligation that he's giving me, for that legal agreement that he's giving to me, right? In other words, whether I end up buying a house from him or not, he gets to keep that $10,000, right? That is, in a way, like a call option, okay? In other words, I don't physically own the house. I just happen to own the right to buy this house for a pre-agreed price within a pre-agreed period of time. And I pay $10,000 as a premium for that right. Or in other words, the cost of that call option. Okay? Now, let's say a year later, the exact same house have gone up to the exact same value, $250,000, right? Nothing changed. However, if you think about it, now your return on investment is 400%. Why? Because the profit in this case will be the $50,000, which is the difference in the house price, but then got a minus $10,000 because no matter what, I cannot get $10,000 back. Isn't it true? Right? So the profit is now $40,000, right? Because I could still buy the house for $200,000 and I can instantly sell it and market for $250,000. I can make $50,000 profit, but I gotta minus the cost, $10,000. So in other words, my real profit is $40,000. But the question is, did it cost me $200,000 to make this $40,000? It did not. It actually only cost me $10,000 to make this $40,000. Does it make sense? So it's what we call the leverage trade, right? So in other words, profit margin is exponentially higher than the traditional route, right? So in other words, technically speaking, if I have this $200,000 with me, then guess what? I could do 20 of these houses. I could have 20 of these transactions because each of them will cost me $10,000, $10,000, $10,000. Isn't it true? You guys follow me so far? Now, some of you say, "Wow, my God, Jack, why don't you do that then? Who in the world would actually do a traditional route?" Well, not quite yet, because again, everything has pros and cons, right? Well, the flip side, what if the house value have gone down to $150,000? Can it happen? Absolutely. Just like stock, can it happen? Absolutely. Just an index account, SP 500. Is it always go up? Never go down? No, it could go down, right? So if the house value has gone down to $150,000, so now, guess what? My return on investment is zero. Zero. Why? Because think about this. Would I still want to exercise that right to buy the house for $200,000, even though the market value is only $150,000? No, I will not, right? I will not do that. So in other words, I will just waste that contract. Right? I will not exercise. I will not put it to use at all. But can I get my $10,000 back? Not at all, right? So in other words, now my profit is zero. I lose the $10,000. That's it. Does it make sense? So in other words, these call options, the reason they call leverage trade because it could be very volatile. You could gain a lot, or you could also lose a lot. In most cases, when these contract expires, when the 12 months is up, assuming that's the contract, then that option is worth nothing, right? Because it's already expired. Make sense? So that's really how the call option works in a nutshell. Okay? So now, put it back to the perspective. So remember, earlier we talked about that insurance company is using the $45 million from the interest earned out of the bond, right? And that $45 million is used to do what? To buy the call option, right? So in other words, typically, for example, let's say S&P 500 call options. So what does that mean? That means if S&P 500 go up, is growing, is gaining this year, this 12 months, can you imagine these call options? It will be explosively profitable, right? So in other words, insurance company can match you, can pay interest to you, right? No problem. But then why there's a cap? Well, because they only have so much money they can use to buy the call options, right? They only have $45 million out of the billion. So, of course, you know, there's a very complicated actuarial calculation behind the scenes just to make sure that connect all the dots and make sure these numbers work out right? But as you can imagine, these call options will be very profitable. So nobody concerned about that, right? That's not people's concern. People's concern is, what if the S&P 500 drops? What if it's negative 15, negative 20%, right? Well, what's going to happen to these call options? These call options will become worthless, right? It becomes zero in value, right? Isn't it true? Which means that $45 million that they have used to buy these call options, it become what? Zero. You guys follow me so far? Right? Lose all. Gone. But then, let's go back to the previous page. What became zero? Was the interest from the bond that was used to buy call option became zero. Valueless, worthless, right? But what about your policy cash value? That was still in the bond. Your cash value was still safe. Does it make sense? That's why insurance company can guarantee you zero floor, not because they are genius or they can control the market, they know exactly when to buy, when to sell. No. It's because of how they hedge against the risk. They never really risk our original principle. They never really put our cash value at risk. That's why they're able to guarantee zero, okay? So, to wrap it up, I pulled up some of these old policies. And again, every insurance, contract, every one of these IUL policy, whether, if you look at your own policy or if you have any of the client's policy, you're gonna see the similar fashion, right? So for the interest of time, I'm just gonna show you one example here, okay? And I show you what to look for, how to look for it, and you know, and you can validate that, okay? So, I took a screenshot of, and by the way, I have to look for certain years, right? Because I know S&P 500 went down in 2022, right? Since 2022, it's been doing really well. So you're not gonna find anything negative, which is, everybody's happy, right? So this is a statement back in June 2023, which basically captures from June 2022 to June 2023, okay? And this is one of the pages of the statement that shows the detailed segment. They call it index segments, right? Really showing how they calculate your interest and how they pay your interest, okay? So, if you look at this is the index, change. In other words, this is the underlying S&P 500 index change from basically a year ago to a year later show up in this statement. So as you can see, like I said, during 2022 to 2023, There is only, I think, June segment that it is positive. The rest of it is pretty much negative, right? And we can validate that by pulling up the SP 500 chart, and we can see that. But what I want you guys to see is this. The rate applied into your contract. Basically, all those negative, they simply just credit us 0%. All right, 0%. In other words, we don't lose anything, we neither gain anything, but during those tough times, 0 is new hero, right? You will be cheering when you have 0 versus many of your colleagues, co-workers, right? They probably complain, they probably cry about their 401k, about their mutual fund, about their stock market, the broker's accounts, or et cetera, right? Because here, you can, at worst case scenario, safeguard your money. You can never, ever, ever worry about losing money, okay? So with that, with these two we have on hand, and I think that think about how many people that you know, how many families out there that with their hard-earned money, that they would love to have a strategy where it can help them to grow, so then they can achieve their financial goals, but at the same time, how many of them they have been through those tough times where, during the market meltdown, during the big corrections of the market, so they end up losing a lot of money. So we should feel very, very proud of what we do. It's not just about having a client. It's not just about making a sales. It's not just about having, X, number of points or getting paid or whatsoever. It's really, if you think about it, is one extra person or one extra family that you perhaps just change that person's or that family's future, that family's fate, right? And I don't mean to sound cheesy, but many of them, many years later, if you look back, many of them probably because of that meeting you had, because of that few account that you helped them to open up, or maybe even better, because that you brought them on board, and as they continue to be educated and have better understanding about these different financial instruments, that one day they're able to retire comfortably, be able to build a very, very solid future, be able to pass assets to their kids, be able to send their children to receive, college educations, be able to do a lot of those things because of that. So never underestimate what you can do for family out there. Never underestimate the impact you can make. We do have a mission to educate 30 million families, and we need everybody's help. So be proud, go out there and share, and do the right thing, and do it in a very proud WSB way. All right, so thank you. Let me get back to you, Lynn.